Chris Stephens.
Thank you, Mr Hollowborn. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair, and a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Strangford. I hope he enjoyed his birthday celebrations at the weekend. I noticed he was a social media sensation at the weekend with all the well-wishers wishing him a happy birthday, so and I hope he had a good weekend. I want to thank and congratulate to my good friend and constituency neighbour, fellow left-winger for Glasgow South. I use the definition loosely, Mr Hollowborn, for bringing this debate forward. It is once again a very important issue which is impacting far too many people in these islands. Now, my good friend talked about one of the more extreme examples, Mubu Tea. He actually undersold what was actually going on in that particular workplace, and it really got to the bizarre to the ridiculous. Because I recall when this hit the headlines, Mr Hollowborn, myself and my good friend were actually sitting next to each other in the chamber of the House of Commons on a Thursday morning at Business Questions, and I'm sure the Minister, who I recall was usually at Business Questions in those days, as we were discussing this great matter. And those of us who were contacting Mubu Tea on the social media platform Twitter were finding ourselves being blocked for asking the question as to why unpaid work trials were happening in this particular workplace. And then other members of the public who were asking Mubu Tea, why are you blocking members of Parliament for asking basic questions? They were finding themselves blocked on the social media Twitter. It was getting to the stage where they were blocking more people than they had followers, Mr Hollowborn. It was one of those ridiculous situations, but such was the pressure that even journalists were asking Mubu Tea these questions. They were finding themselves blocked until they relented and they started to engage with Unite. Brian Simpson, who is, I know, a fantastic trade unionist and a constituent of my honourable friends, who does great work organising trade unions in these areas where exploitation takes place. Mr Hollowborn, I want to make it very clear that the SNP are still calling on the UK Government to ban the exploitative unpaid work trials and protect workers. But we shouldn't have to wait for this government to act, Mr Hollowborn. And as I alluded to in my intervention earlier, we've waited 6 years for this employment bill to appear before us. 2017, the government had said that they were going to put forward an employment bill to ban exploitative practices that were happening in the workplace. And then we were told, well, Brexit's taken over. And now we're being told recently, well, we'll allow parliamentary time. If there's sufficient parliamentary time, they'll put forward an employment bill. But it doesn't stop them, Mr Hollowborn, introducing immigration bill after immigration bill after immigration bill and finding parliamentary time for that, and not a very real issue that's happening and the exploitative practices which are happening in far too many workplaces across these islands. So perhaps the Minister will update the House on when we will finally see an employment bill tabled by the government to address unpaid work trials and all the other issues which come with it, which I'll come on to later. As my good friend said, he introduced an unpaid trial work periods bill in July 2017. And guess what, Mr Hollowborn? I know you'll be shocked when I say this. It was talked out by a minister. How many private members' bills have we seen talked out by a minister? And I would hope that we will need to review how private members' bills are put forward in this place, and to stop that practice where the government are allowed to where government ministers are allowed to keep talking to 2:30 on the button, and then those bills disappear. It really is disappointing, but I know that that's a view that's shared by others across the House. And he's also led in a number of debates on this issue. He's been a consistent campaigner in dealing with the unpaid work trial issue, and I hope that both the Shadow Front Bench and indeed the Minister will praise him for his work in shining a light on these particular issues. And in a response to a written parliamentary question by my honourable friend, the UK Government, asking the UK Government to bring forward legislative proposals, the UK Government said existing legislation already bans unpaid work trials. as they are not part of a legitimate recruitment process. But my honourable friend has given an example, as did the honourable member for Strangford, on these unpaid work trials happening all over the economy, which are not part of a recruitment process. And indeed, as my honourable friend said, it's dealing with staff shortages or people who have been off sick and filling in for them. And it really is a scandalous practice. And I hope the Minister noted that both my constituency friend, constituency neighbour and the honourable member for Strangford, this issue about people having to buy uniforms, to go to an unpaid work trial is an absolute ridiculous practice, Mr Holloway. I think the Minister will need to answer how we can deal with that particular exploitation, because it is exploitation. The trial work periods are, as my honourable friend said, they can be a legitimate way to assess a candidate's skills and suitability, as well as give an individual the opportunity to assess whether a workplace suits them, which can be just as important, actually, whether that would suit them, although I do note that the Department of Work and Pensions is trying to force people to take up more hours, and I think that there's issues in relation to that. However, if an employer offers a trial period to a person, then it should be paid. There should also be feedback as well, because there was many examples given of unpaid work trials where nobody hears anything after, whether it's a day or a couple of days or even a couple of hours. They then don't hear anything from these employers. That's a practice that needs to end, I would suggest. Perhaps an employment bill could deal with some of that, I would suggest, Mr Holloway. But what's interesting, again, Chair, is that the UK Government has confirmed that unpaid working time, which can include unpaid trial shifts, were a factor in 29% of cases when 208 employers were named for failing to pay £1.2 million to around 12,000 workers in order to pay £2 million in penalties. Now, it suggests to me there might be an enforcement issue there, Mr Holloway, because if there is adequate legislation in place, then I would suggest, if the practice is still going on to the degree that what my good friend from Glasgow South and good friend from Strangford have outlined in this debate, perhaps there's an enforcement issue. So perhaps the Minister can tell us what enforcement is taking place within government to ensure that these unpaid work trials are not exploitative. Perhaps he could start, Mr Holloway, by telling us just how many vacancies currently exist in the compliance unit of the national minimum wage, because it would suggest to me that if we had more workers employed by the state, enforcing the national minimum wage, as the government have said in my answer, in their parliamentary answer to my good friend from Glasgow South, that perhaps if we could do with more enforcement and more enforcement officers, perhaps we would be finding out that this practice is, as my two friends have suggested earlier, still widespread and still happening in too many workplaces going on. Because the UK Government could have supported my constituency neighbour's private member's bill, or they could have brought in their own legislation. Perhaps the Minister can tell us what legislation is proposed and what timetable will be allowed to have an employment bill, because we might not agree with every single provision in that employment bill, but it would give every single member of this House an opportunity to raise other issues, to put forward an amendments to deal with this particular issue. And I give way to my good friend.
Will you allow that point, because it speaks to, I'm grateful, Mr Holloway, he speaks to an important issue that you touched upon earlier, which is this practice of talking bills out. Having got an assurance from the Minister, the then Minister, not this Minister, that the bill would not be talked out, it would be given a fair hearing, it would be allowed to go through the process, and then rather dishonourably doing the opposite of what they had told me, what we actually ended up with was, the bill not having a fair hearing in the House and it not being given the proper readings that it ought to have been given as a bill from a Member of Parliament. And the result of that is we're back here 6 years later discussing the same problem.
Well, I thank my good friend for that intervention. In fact, as I recall, it might very well have been my good friend's private member's bill when the Minister rose from his feet and said, "I will be concluding my remarks at 2:30 p.m. at the beginning of his remarks. Now, that's just a completely scandalous way of dealing with it, but he's absolutely right. We've had these assurances before that bills won't be talked out, and then lo and behold, on the day that the bill is up for discussion, that is exactly what happens. Mr Hollybone, we firmly oppose this practice, but in association with it, because of the sectors of the economy that my good friend referred to, we also oppose the inappropriate use of zero-hour contracts. And some of this goes together, where there's an unpaid work trial for a zero-hour contract job, both exploitative practices, I would suggest, Chair, and these non-standard types of employment that offer workers minimal job or financial security really have to end, particularly in a cost of living crisis. I would suggest that if the government are really serious about helping people earn more money, it needs to put forward that legislation that stops unpaid work trials, that stops exploitative zero-hour contracts and exploit these other issues. And I'll give way to my good friend.
I'm just sitting there very conscious, Mr Chairman, of the bill that's approximately 6 years ago had anticipated that it would go through Westminster and would have addressed this anomaly. Does the honourable gentleman, like myself, and I'm sure he does, feel aggrieved that there's been 6 years when the possibility of having legislative change, there's been 6 years since then where people have been exploited, and there's probably been thousands and thousands of people who have lost out on what was rightly theirs?
I do agree with that. And indeed, you know, it's interesting just to remind the House as to why this promise of an employment bill came about. It was because of the Taylor Review. It was the government's own tasked Matthew Taylor with reviewing working practices that were taking place across these islands. And the Taylor Review listed a whole series of recommendations, many of which are still not been dealt with in a legislative basis. And if the government are going to ask and task people to carry out that sort of work, you would expect it to be backed with action. And I think it's quite extraordinary, as the Honourable Member for Strangford have said, is that having had that they've refused to do that. Now, Mr Hollybone, the Scottish Government, obviously, and the other devolved administrations can do their bit, but they can only do so much because employment law is reserved to this place, unfortunately. I would suggest that if employment law was devolved to the devolved administrations, the Scottish Parliament, we would find that there would be a lot more fairer work practices taking place across the board. So, Mr Hollybone, I'm conscious of time. Let me just end by saying that if the government had viewed trade unions as a key social partner in this country, we would see the end to these sorts of practices going on in the workplace. And I support wholly what my constituency neighbour is trying to do in this area. Thank you.